This lecture is on the history of psychology and the seven perspectives. We start with pre-scientific psychology. Pre-scientific psychology was all about learning about human nature. It starts with Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who believed that human nature came from the heart and not from the head. He was wrong on that, but this beginning to study about who humans are is really kind of the earliest form of looking at oneself, which is a big part of psychology. The scientific revolution was another very important part of pre-scientific psychology because the scientific revolution allowed us to use experimentation to create logical cause and effect relationships, where they used experimentation rather than just observation. Finally, the Enlightenment looked at human nature again, in this case, humans' place within society, which again is one of these pre-revolutionary type things. The first psychologist was Wilhelm Wundt, an Austrian psychologist who was working in Leipzig, Germany. He wanted to know about the process of hearing. So he basically played a sound and had his participants touch a button once they realized they heard a sound. He found out that it was not exactly at the same time. And so he realized that there was a mental process going on that allowed people to try to figure that out. He had a student named Edward Titchener. Titchener and Wilhelm Wundt formed the first early school of psychology called structuralism. Structuralism wanted to focus on the structure of people's thoughts. They use introspection and reflection to figure out exactly what people were thinking and what they were thinking as they did very basic processes, like petting a cat. Well, first I have to move my hand. Now I have to touch the cat. Now I have to move my hand again, and so on. But that can become subjective. It's based on the opinion of the individual, not just what is actually occurring within the brain. William James formed the second early school of functionalism. He was at Harvard in the United States. And for him, it was about why were different behaviors occurring. For him, he wanted to know what was the evolutionary purpose of a thought process or of a behavior. Why would this help human beings survive more than any others? So he wanted to know the why of the thoughts rather than what the thoughts were. William James had a student that was really, really good. Her name was Mary Whiton Calkins. But because she was a woman, she faced extra resistance. She was not allowed to receive a PhD from Harvard, despite being the top of her class, and was forced to get a PhD at Radcliffe, which is the women's college, and so she opted not to get it. The first woman with a PhD in psychology was Margaret Floyd Washburn, and even she faced resistance. She wanted to join this prestigious organization called the Organization of Experimental Psychology, but they wouldn't let her because she was a woman. Other early schools of psychology include Gestalt, which looked at, this was from Germany, and this looked at how we group things together and how we group forms together. And then psychoanalysis, which looked at our unconscious thoughts and our thoughts that we can't control and how that impacted who we were. In more modern psychology, the last early school was behaviorism. Behaviorism focused entirely on the behavior of the individual rather than on the thoughts. Freudian psychology was what followed Freud, and they focused on early childhood and how early childhood would basically make it that it impacted our day-to-day life today. Then we had humanistic psychology, which focused on how nurturing, that came in about the 1950s, how nurturing and help from others could make people better. And finally, we had cognitive psychology, which focused on the thought process again, but now the specific thoughts and what they were rather than something that was subjective. Today, we have a more modern version, and that's called neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, which looks at the combination between our thoughts and our cognition, or our thoughts, our cognition, and the things that are occurring within our brain. Early psychology was just that. Today we have the seven perspectives, where each of the perspectives is what we call a level of analysis, which is a different way of looking at human thought or human behavior. The main ideas behind level of analysis say that there's three primary influences to our behavior and thoughts, also called the biopsychosocial model. One is biology, which is our inner thoughts, our brain chemistry, our hormones, the way our organs work, and how that impacts what we do. Our psychology, which is our thoughts, thinking about our early childhood, our perception of who we are as individuals, and finally, social, which is the influence of other people, either individuals, a group of people, or a large group like society, and how all of those can impact human behavior today. We have 7 primary perspectives. Each of these looks at a different way to explain human behavior and human thought. The first is behavioral. Behavioral looks at how all behaviors are learned. When we get out of the womb, we don't have a lot of understanding of behaviors, so we have to learn what behaviors are acceptable and what are not, what behaviors work and what don't. The biological perspective looks at the brain chemistry, the hormones, the neurotransmitters, and how that might impact the human experience. Cognitive psychology looks at our thought process and how our thought process affects our behaviors. If we're experiencing depression, it might be because we are focusing on our negative thoughts. The evolutionary perspective focuses on how different characteristics of humans, the behaviors that we're doing, how they could have helped us survive back when we were cave people. The humanistic perspective looks at how humans can reach their ultimate potential and how they can receive help for doing so. They need to have help to reach their ultimate potential. Without it, they're not going to be as good as they can be. So help within their environment, with the people in those environments. The psychoanalytic and psychodynamic perspective looks at the impact of early childhood and our unconscious, and how those things influence our day-to-day behaviors. And finally, the sociocultural perspective looks at the ideas of society and groups, and how groups and society can influence human behavior and human thought. That is it for the perspectives. Please let me know if you have any questions.